Hello everyone, today we talk about the Crown of Aragon at request, and because I noticed that I never discussed it per se, but we made something here and there about Aragonese Naples, about the, some Spanish, videos in general about political institutional development, some type of troopers and so on, but never quite addressed the broader picture. So I'm glad to discuss it. And specifying that we're talking about the Crown of Aragon, so a composite monarchy that united the different possessions dynastically, under one king, right? We're talking about the Kingdom of Aragon, the County of Barcelona, and as properly the core land, right? And as we'll see, it was also more composite, also not just in the Iberian Peninsula, but abroad. And its political peak, let's say, of power was in the late Middle Ages. By the way, there is a medieval Iberia playlist in which I discussed the political institutional development of the Iberian monarchies exactly in these centuries, right? It will partly do it for the previous centuries, but naturally things were, relatively simpler, at least in terms of dynamics, internal statal dynamics, but also more complex from a, territorial point of view, albeit on a narrower base, because it was more fragmented, with a characteristic that was called essentially telesocratic, right? And the idea that the Crown of Aragon expanded from today's, essentially a large portion of today's eastern Spain, right? And even parts of southern France, especially along the Mediterranean, to include a lot of other lands under its control, namely the Balearic Islands, Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, Malta, southern Italy from 1442, and even parts of Greece in the broader, fragmentation and dynastic, complexity had followed the collapse of the Byzantine Empire 1204 and maintaining this Greek dominations until 1388 roughly. And it's a very complex story, and this is what makes it more fascinating. So today, naturally, we can't resume it, we can't look at it integrally. That's why we will make other videos naturally dealing with various chunks in parallel. As I was saying before, we already discussed something here and there also about its foreign dominations and so on. And the main characteristic of this land is that fundamentally they were not united politically except at the level of kingship, right? And this is a specific characteristic of the Aragonese crown dominions, political cultures, right? Especially in Spain, that would remain importantly, right, as throughout also the modern age. That when we say Spain was reunited altogether with the union of Castile and Aragon. Yes, but that was essentially a dynastic union, not a statal unification, right? That would happen only in the 18th century. And especially these lands, as you know, also for autonomistic tendencies still today, etc., for reasons that now we don't digress on, are, in a sense, there's no completely direct link, but surely inherit partly the distances, the issues that this reality was, right? And one could argue, like, we don't make what-ifs on Schwerpunkt, but also what a different political culture would have kind of brought, maybe, for example, for a more unified reality, considering its Mediterranean potential that, in a sense, was also eventually limited, in part by the Italian maritime republics, in part by the more powerful Castile, that was instead, as you know, much more of a land power, but in a sense also the largest in Spain, but especially it had a much more centralized control as a feudal monarch, where the king had a much greater influence and control on the various estates, differently from Aragon, where things were really, really different. So as we were saying before, the king fundamentally ruled over each autonomous policy according to the laws of the land, of the community. And it would naturally, in the process, like this was not radically different from other countries, right? Just that in these lands, the monarchy control was much looser. And this sum, however, a really impressive sum of territories that in a sense were not autonomous just in terms of local customs, but properly sometimes in a much more concrete political way, right? When we look at Aragon, for example, and we look at Sicily eventually when it was conquered, we look at during the 13th and 14th century, we see essentially two different kingdoms pursuing autonomous policies, sometimes even one against the other, right? So its unitary character here, it had an enormous, these lands had been more solidly unified, and that would have been more really difficult also from the starting basis in this regard, would have had a much greater control. And in fact, the Spanish Union, this enormous, mostly Castilian-based power was, naturally at the conquest of Europe and the consolidation of many, also of this further Aragonese elements that were now Spanish to core and brought under a much more solid control. In fact. And in medieval times, the king managed from this enormous set of territories to rise a certain amount of surplus through the tax structure, etc., and dealing separately with the different Cortes or Cortes, depending also because the names are different. Here there is Catalan, there are other languages, so they varied literally in a very different way. Particularly, in fact, from what were a bit the core lands of the continental Iberian ones of the Kingdom of Aragon, the Principality of Catalonia, and the Kingdom of Valencia. And thus, the larger crown of Aragon must not be confused with these constitutive elements, right? The Kingdom of Aragon, which we speak today, maybe even conventionally or colloquially, you say, oh, it was Aragon. Yeah, it was, okay, but it was technically properly the crown of Aragon. The Kingdom of Aragon was just a chunk of it, right? Surely very important, foundational, as together with the County of Barcelona, indeed, right? The more continental part, in Barcelona being the Maritime, where eventually also the real center of power, properly also economically shifted because it was more, the sense already more centralized with more cities, with more traffics, more cash available, and more projection capability, especially in the more profitable Western Mediterranean in itself, right? But it's important to bear in mind the distinction. So, in 1469, the Crown of Aragon and the one of Castile are united dynastically, as we've seen. So, we speak of the Spains, plural, to what eventually would lead to the Spanish monarchy, that was a composite one, effectively under the Habsburgs, and the Aragonese crown is abolished in 1716 by King Philip V of Bourbon, right after the defeat of Archduke Charles III of Aragon, because that was for every of these possessions was a different title and different order. In the War of Spanish Succession, that changed a big deal of things also, as you know, not just in Spain, but also and consequently in its dependencies in Italy, and so on. So where the Spanish period, say, finishes, as is what conventionally meant, especially in the north, and the the Austrians, yes, the Habsburgs actually remained because Spain was, at that point, effectively Bourbon ruled, finished. But coming back to our Middle Ages. So a bit of geography here. So the main center of the Crown of Aragon specifically was in the Aragonese interland, properly Zaragoza, right? Famous among many things. These were lands that had belonged to the Muslims before. Zaragoza was famous for its blades. There were areas molded right, communitarily speaking, during the Reconquista. So there is all a story and background behind this, but we begin also from a bit later. Here, traditionally, the Aragonese kings were crowned at La Seu Cathedral, with all its symbolical attachment. However, factually, the capital, if we want to use this anachronism, and surely leading cultural, as we've seen, administrative and economic center of the crown was Barcelona, right? And Valencia was second, fundamentally, in this. And also, important center was Palma of Mallorca, where that was added later on, even here part of the Reconquista, and so an important logistical center, probably a center to core in seaport and so on, for the Mediterranean connections, etc. So as we were saying before, the Crown of Aragon eventually included the Kingdom of Aragon, the Principality of Catalonia, that was until the 12th century the County of Barcelona, and we will see that story another time. The Kingdom of Valencia, the Kingdom of Mallorca, the Kingdom of Sicily, Malta, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Kingdom of Sardinia. So as we will see, there are different things here to remind you also about, specifically about the fact these were kingdoms were created at some point, right? Even during this same time, there wasn't, for example, anything like the Kingdom of Naples and the Kingdom of Sicily. That was just one kingdom technically, at least from a formal point of view. Also, the Kingdom of Sardinia was created from scratch, fundamentally, by Frederick II in the Holy Roman Empire. The Iberian monarchs were actually involved within, at this point in the core, in the heart of European policy. Think about Alfonso X of Castile, when became King of the Romans. So, there was a lot going on, and definitely the Mediterranean, as we have seen very often, was at this point definitely the most advanced still, as broader Europe, as the area where, the greater capitals, greater wealth, greater things were going on. Essentially, everybody wanted to venture the south to try to centralize further and to levy more, more power, more money, more labor force, right, etc. Because these lands abounded of them, with more developed administrative structures, better connections, etc., and naturally the dream of Reconquest of Constantinople. And Spain was naturally fragmented enough, as we've seen, and especially in its eastern side. So from the Mediterranean side, one that should have opened the most to the great maritime expansion. The Crown of Aragon knew definitely how to move very cleverly, but always resented in the sense of this parcelization of its power and the unwillingness of the estates to confer more power to properly a centralized government, not to expand, because definitely that's what they did, and that's why they were clever by doing it. But always saying, okay, we want to be autonomous, we want to mind our own business factually. Now, the Crown of Aragon stretched also further in this regard, more intermittently in some areas. For example, at some point, it controlled Montpellier, the Provence, like at least the coast, Corsica. That factually was never quite really occupied, but namely it fell under it because it was annexed initially to the Kingdom of Sardinia, that eventually was simply came up to be a part, right? And but also the Duchy of Athens and Neopatras in Latin Greece, this for dynastic ties that conferred to the crown that addition as well. But as we've seen also in the late 14th century, that would be lost. And there were also broader connections of the subjects of the Crown of Aragon with other important. Think about the Almogavars, right? That were independent as an entity on their own. They were just mercenaries, but ideally they had this national affiliation, right? That is very much felt if you read the Chronicle of Montaner, etc. There is a sense of pride, proto-national, let's say, sense of oneself that emerges from these troops. But anyhow, we'll talk about them on another. Actually, we made a video about the Catalan company, and you see also it was very composite, right? It wasn't really an emanation to core of the air, but surely it was connected with lands of Aragon, for which many mercenaries indeed served other countries, like even the Angevins, even powers that were on paper, in general, theoretically enemy, but quite weren't. That's why before I was saying that. Let's say the even I don't know, Sicilian policy could be very different from the Aragonese one in many ways, and be intermittently, first with the papacy, then with the emperor, but maybe not with Aragon at that point. More like trying to solve matters with Naples. So it was really complicated, and we can't see it today. But I promise we will, time allowing, go all in these details at some point. As we were saying before, also this construction emerged from the Reconquista itself, right? From the withdrawal of Muslim control over the Iberian Peninsula, and exploiting, and therefore also being in part even supported by the same typhus, depending on political circumstances and so on. We made a video this spring or early summer about the Mudéjars, right, explaining how important Muslim presence was actually in Christian lands at this point, and specifically in the Crown of Aragon. Right, it was really important, really, also because probably it had more economical. The middle classes were kind of stronger in that sense, and in generally speaking, in this push towards the south, the Aragonese crown met with the Castilian army, right? That was essentially trying to advance eastwards toward the Mediterranean region of Murcia. And subsequently, the Aragonese crown focused just on Mediterranean. As they gave up the continent, most of, at least of their continental projects, because Castile was stronger. To do Greece properly, if you know Spanish orography more or less, you have an idea that these lands, these eastern lands, were more mountainous actually than Castile. Is more like a plateau, and so there was some ease even at distinguishing these territories in a broader sense, and you understand why they were more devoted to different directions, and they had different political and social characteristics, partly also on the basis of that. And also, that at this point, the generally speaking, after Las Navas, the Iberian monarchies kind of slow down properly with the effort of the Reconquest. That also was sometimes, sometimes they would ally, the same Christians would ally themselves with Granada against one another. They had the Aragonese had problems also with the Italians, as we will see, that allied themselves with Granada to counter their expanse. So there was a bit of, realpolitik, intermittently, varied allegiances and orientations on the international level. And as we've seen, the Mediterranean policy was more profitable for the Crown of Aragon, right? We've seen that it arrived to stretch as far as Greece, also the Barbary coast. Portugal, from the other side of the peninsula, was instead open. We made a video recently stopping at the beginning of the Age of Exploration, but eventually, we explained the reason why it's instead opened, in fact, the same towards the Atlantic, because that was at that point the only sensible direction it could take realistically. We named the Almogavars, right? That participated in creations of this Mediterranean dominions, because in a way or another they were connected with their homeland, and they would partly serve its own interests also, under the control of the same monarchs, right? This is quite important. There are the same, for example, the Catalans, etc., as kings, probably they were imbued also with a deep sense of chivalric culture, feudal culture. This emerges staunchly from the sources, but they served themselves this rabble. These essentially the Almogavars were mainly light infantry. They weren't technically, from a strictly material culture, technical point of view, anything special, right? It's just that they were hungry and angry, and therefore they had a high morale, and they struck important results here and there in a Mediterranean that was undergoing at that point a crisis, had left many areas dramatically fragmented, especially in Greece, in Asia Minor, but also in southern Italy, and for this reason they fit in, right? And the monarchs of eastern Spain were quite quick to exploit that, as we will see. And carving also properly some some powers, some minor seigneuries across southern Europe, broadly made. As for other powers like Venice, for example, historiography at some point threw around this term of empire, right, which is incorrect by the nature properly of these dominions, right? Surely the Crown of Aragon was a great power, actually one of the major powers in Europe, easily at its height in the end of the Middle Ages. It ruled an important part of the Mediterranean for hundreds of years, with an important naval power. There was a broader ambition to, let's say, extend control over the broader Mediterranean. This was factually never possible, right? As long as the Italian republics were around, this was basically unfeasible, right? And it would never happen, actually, because even later on, the main enemies of Aragon were the Genoese. The Aragonese allied themselves with Venice to counter them in this sense, but Genoa was still there, right? It actually opened the Atlantic route before the same Spanish kingdoms, crossing the Gibraltar Strait and settling as merchant community in Sevilla, trading along the Atlantic coast, Spain, France, up to England, with for the English fool, so with the local. So we are in a time in which you cannot oust a maritime power, right? That would happen completely. That would happen just in Victorian age, where you can effectively control a stretch of sea, right? The Aragonese never had properly the base but no power could have at the time in the first place to even presume that it could take out the major naval powers at the time, were essentially Venice, Genoa, and even if you look at the later Spanish Empire, right, the control on great parts of Italy, at the end of the day, if you look at the Spanish fleets and Lepanto, etc., these were always essentially Italian, right? That were the bulk of naval force, nautical culture, engineering, etc. Aragon was surely the third in this picture, though, right? And it contributed dramatically with the Saint Genoa, in part also with Pisa, etc., that at this point was kind of declining, with the great development of cartography, of the compilation of maritime laws, right, in world history. For example, the Libre del Consolat del Mar, right, a book of the Consulate of the Sea, written in Catalan, is one of the oldest of such maritime laws in the history of the world. And this tells you how blended in some cultures were. Think even about Colombo, that was mixed origin, actually Jewish first coming from Aragon, then however being actually himself raised a Genoese, etc. So there was a very mixed culture in the process, because the sea unites in this regard, and Barcelona was definitely one of the most important trade centers in the Mediterranean, and it emanated kind of properly maritime power that arguably wasn't present truly, not even in Portugal. You see, the Portuguese also extensively used Genoese crews and admirals, etc. Was more of a fuel power. They also but more centralized. Aragon, and especially Catalonia, remained this kind. It's as if basically the closest thing in Europe that, aside from some Byzantine, autonomized city in the east, but with much lower commercial potential. The only thing it resembled effectively an Italian maritime republic, right? And by those peak standards. So this is really crucial and important. And however, speaking of what we were doing, of the term of empire, this is not really it. The Crown of Aragon was mostly like a confederacy, right? No centralized kingdom, and especially it wouldn't kind of exploit systematically other people's lands in an imperialistic fashion, right? As we've seen, they had a dynastic sum of dominions, but these dominions were effectively ruled on their own, right? The greatest ones being Sicily, Naples, that were at that point, seen an important collapse from the previous Norman Swabian centralized tradition that also the Angevins had to cope with, where the barons largely took over the interland, and for these monarchs there wasn't much of a headway, but through negotiation with the same, albeit remaining some of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, there is no doubt, right? Especially when they had always been, but with the Crown of Aragon, the Sicilian plus the Neapolitan crowns that were technically still the Sicilian, but this was late medieval and early modern times, one of the largest powers in Europe, no doubt. There is not much of a talk about that, also because the fact that these became vice kingdoms, vice realms, technically under the Spanish crown, naturally oriented their policy in a less autonomous way than before. So they hardly ever took the venture on their own as an independent power. Also, they were kind of fragmented. There were states within states. For example, the Principality of Taranto was largely autonomous, almost a quasi-independent state from Naples itself, even throughout the early modern age. So these were extremely complex realities and everything, but by far, very far from any kind of imperial conception, because there was factually none of this in concrete. In medieval times, it's very hard to find something like that, at least in the modern imperial sense that we understand. Nor official Aragonese documents ever referred to the crown as an empire or anything. Like, there's none of this properly as it was a matter of political culture. It would have never allowed such a conception for the same communities that made up the crown's power. So, going at the origin, the Crown of Aragon is born, let's say, in 1137, right? At this point, the Kingdom of Aragon and the County of Barcelona, along with other minor possessions such as the County of Provence, Girona, Sardinia, Osona, and other territories, merged by dynastic union, right? This area of, let's say, of Catalonia and its coast, rising up to the north and southern France, had always been historically connected, right? Since ancient times, we think about Massilia and Empúries, etc. So they were close, they shared, they were rich, right? They were urbanized. They carried out an important function for trade from the Western Mediterranean to France, essentially. However, there was no, let's say, real center of power. You know that at this point, the Kingdom of France itself had not managed to extend its control toward the south of its own country, because formally it belonged to it. But aside from the eastern one, because the Provence eventually fell into the Holy Roman Empire, so it was essentially a frontier area that, as far as the largely coastal interests of the Catalonian elites, was the ideal, like it had been for the Muslims before, for hundreds of years, to essentially penetrate these areas, coexisting with them, etc., and trading, because that's the only thing that they cared about. The same Occitans largely, at some point preferred the balance with Muslims. and their presence next door, rather than ending up controlled more directly by the northern French, as would happen later on. And consider that the Rhone Valley, especially in Provence, was one of the main highways of international trade from, as we've seen, Mediterranean into Central Europe. It was connected with the Champagne fairs and so on. So really important. That route would decline later on, especially as it would be actually mostly dominated by Italian trade, and it would decline, ironically, actually, when the Genoese were forced to, as we were saying before, to open the Atlantic route, because Venice and Aragon had allied against right in. But at that point the Rhone Valley highway kind of declined dramatically, also because France was engulfed in the 100 Years' War. Venice had opened the routes with Germany through the Alps, or at least consistently strengthened them, and Genoa, as we've seen, crossed the straits to go to England. So a lot changed at that point. The Crown of Aragon was born upon the marriage of Petronilla of Aragon and Raymond Berenguer IV of Barcelona, right? And these titles would be combined dynastically in the person of their son, Alfonso II of Aragon, right, who rose to the throne in 1162. This union respected the existing institutions and parliaments of both territories, right? So the combined state was initially known as Regno, Dominio et Corona Aragonum et Catalonia, and later on Corona Regum Aragonia, which is very fascinating because it stresses the crown of the kings of Aragon, right? So there was the idea of the multiplicity of the various dominions, right, summed up maybe in a single person, but still as different people. You understand this? This is very important. Or Corona Aragonum, so crown of Aragon, or simply Aragon. This was also the battle cry of the Aragonese armies and so on. Now, Petronilla's father, King Ramiro, nicknamed the Monk, who had reigned between 1134-37, and who had been raised in the monastery of Saint Pons and the Thomière, Viscount of Béziers, as a Benedictine monk, right, was the youngest of three brothers. And this had been the remaining being Peter I, reigning between 1294 and 1104, and Alfonso I, nicknamed El Batallador, so the battler, reigning between 1104 and 1134. And they had fought bravely against Castile, preventing its extension, right, of control also in the east, right, in their lands, right, because the Castilians had often such aims. But still, at any opportunity, the same Aragonese would try this. It's just that they were the weaker side on land. So at this, Ramiro was forced to leave his monastic life. He was proclaimed King of Aragon. He had married Agnes, who was sister of the Duke of Aquitaine. So other southern French connection that would always exist, like between Aragon and especially the County of Toulouse up to the annexation by the Capetians. And he had betrothed his only daughter, Petronilla, as we've seen, to Raymond Berenguer, Count of Barcelona. And such wedding agreement provided Berenguer with the title of Princeps Aragonum and Dominator Aragonensis, so basically the first among equals, or ruler in the sense of the kingdom, and commander. Dominator is in a sense of, he who disposes properly, also military command of the Aragonese forces. However, the title of King of Aragon per se, right, so as a monarch, was reserved for Ramiro II and Berenguer's future sons by agreement. So at the time, it was said, okay, just wait, that for the descendants to accumulate these titles dynastically, because we're not going to recognize to you directly in life. And Raymond Berenguer IV was the first ruler of the United Dynasty, however, calling himself Count of Barcelona and, as we've seen, Prince of Aragon, right? Because Count of Barcelona he already was, but the Prince of Aragon was, in this sense, not quite the monarch strictly meant. Alfonso II, as we've seen, so the son of Petronilla and Raymond Berenguer, inherited these two realms, right, that were very different in nature, right? The House of Jimenez looked south in a battle against Castile for the control of the middle Ebro Valley in the Iberian Peninsula, while the House of the Counts of Barcelona looked north to its origins. Actually, were Occitan, right? We haven't talked about the marches here that were originated from Carolingian times, but fundamentally there had been a great communion, a great similarity and kinship with Occitania and Catalonia itself. So they were two distinctly, diametrically opposed realities, right? A terrestrial continental one, mostly the first, and a northern, maritime one, the other. And especially, however, the latter had very powerful connections with Toulouse, Provence, and Foix, and along properly the Mediterranean coast towards the east. So having a quite discrete economic and trade, commercial activity that really procured a lot of wealth. So at this point, Alfonso II was pressured by the various estates of the crown to expand in different directions, and he committed himself to the conquest of Valencia, as the Aragonese nobility mostly demanded. And this, however, doesn't take away that he attributed more importance to the expansion and consolidation of the Catalan interests in Occitania. Alfonso signed the Treaties of Cazorla. It was a multilateral treaty between Navarre, Aragon, Leon, Portugal, and Castile to better, stabilize the frontier borders and the areas of influence, sphere of influence of each kingdom, right? So to confer at least broader stability to its own conquest, its own consolidation, internal consolidations and external expansion. And he also managed to conquer Valencia by renouncing, however, the Aragonese rights of annexing Murcia in order to secure the Castilian border, right? Because if he had gone further, he would have at that point incurred into the Castilian retaliation, because the Castilians too were wanting an opening in the Mediterranean, and even if a worse one, naturally it was much better placed one of Catalonia, but still, right? And that was also speaking for the Aragonese, second position in the Iberian Peninsula. For the Castilians were acting from a position of force, right? And at the same time, the Aragonese may have, at that point, remained inflexible, tried to fight to counter Castilian expansion, but as we've seen, the Occitanian interests were much greater at that point and much more profitable to exploit. So that was an insight. I don't know how, probably was the right thing to do. Surely at the moment there was no way to predict how things would have ensued further, how the French would have eventually consolidated also these northern positions, but at that point it was surely much more profitable for also centralizing further in the same Catalonia through the wealth flowing in. And there was also a consistent competition proper with the Occitanian powers. It wasn't just, ties are not just friendly relations, right? Naturally, all the Dukes of Aquitaine, the Kings of Navarre, as well, in the same Iberian Peninsula, the Counts of Foix, the Counts of Toulouse were more powerful, and the Counts of Barcelona were substantially rivals since an early age, since the time of Carolingian expansion, consolidation in the area. These were the Hispanic marchers, right, in the Pays of Occitanie. And the House of Barcelona managed to spread its influence further north, thanks mostly through strong family ties, right? Especially in the area of the County of Provence, as we've seen it, but also in the County of Toulouse, in the County of Foix, right? So much that, as we will see better at some point, the Catalans were involved, together with the whole Crown of Aragon, was involved in the actually in the defense of the Cathars, right, against the Albigensian Crusade, right? So much that the famous Battle of Muret, in which the same Peter of Aragon was killed, right, is a bit the broader proof of this. You know that later on the French would go on. The crusade was overall a disaster, especially after the death of Simon de Montfort. Massive distractions, a weakening of the whole region, and still, however, great autonomistic push. Eventually, it is even in there through dynastic ties that Louis IX consolidates France, and its descendants will actually wage war to the same Aragon. They would invade it, right? Eventually, it would be Philip IV that bailed out of it because he realized that was kind of a hopeless situation. He concentrated mostly against the Flemish in a moment of important, delicate balance. It was a hell of a difficult moment in Europe, and also for such a big state like France. This position against also the Catholic Church at the end of the day, because the papacy perfectly knew what the Aragonese was doing, as you know, they went nowhere with it, right? There was no way that the church, its allies, showed an incredible capacity and valor in properly, going iron fist against any form of heterodoxy that could contestate, the creation of a parallel church. Like, never think that the Cathars were some poor martyrs, that they had inquisitions themselves. They had created a parallel copy of the Catholic Church that perfectly mirrored the papal curia with all its instruments, its whole ideology, etc., persecutions. So it was actually a pretty dark thing, and it's interesting that the Crown of Aragon backed this in hoping still to carve naturally on a local base some further power. So you know what happened. Innocent III called upon Philip II of France to suppress the Albigensians, and this area would later on fall unavoidably under the Capetian dynasty control, that were simply, even in there, the strongest from the north. This is interesting also because of what we were saying before, because France and Castile were, together with England and Sicily, were basically at that point the strongest monarchies, right? Properly in terms of concrete power, of centralization of control under the single monarchs. So it's possible the Crown of Aragon in this regard was still relatively conservative, hadn't made the further step to, or couldn't simply, as we've seen, centralizing further by the local, because of the local communities that just wanted to be alone. They were in a relatively sheltered position that allowed them to survive without too much pressure, objectively, because there was, aside from the French that eventually bailed out, but there was no major, massive invasion of the Crown of Aragon, right? At least from the various feuds with Castilians, other powers, Navarre, etc. But they were more or less, they were dynastic issues mostly, and that surely aimed at incorporating the various territories on the long run, but still recognizing the and consolidating further in the process. We've seen it with county, eventually the Kingdom of Portugal, to this properly their own states, their own realities, as something on their own. The Battle of Muret, fought on September the 12th, 1213, is quite famous. Is actually the first example of in Western warfare of a flank attack from feudal knights. This in the 13th century would go like at the top of tactics in feudal culture at its apex and carried out, and reflects even in there the West, the French development properly at all levels. This is the cycle of glory for the French cavalry, and the same Peter of the Second of Aragon was killed in this battle while he was fighting against him. The battle also was an important blow properly to the nobility of Toulouse, Foix, and other vassals of the Crown of Aragon, right? And the following Treaty of Paris in 1229 saw the Crown of Aragon, in fact, agreeing to renounce its rights over South Occitania, with the integration of these territories in the dominions of the French king. So it was kind of a definitive, at the beginning of the 13th century, the definitive recognition of French superiority in the north of the Pyrenees. King James I of Aragon, also known as the Conqueror, during the 13th century, resumed thus an expansion towards the south, and the sea and the maritime dimension, conquering and incorporating Mallorca, the largest of the Balearic Islands, and also a good part of the Kingdom of Valencia into the crown. Right, because in all this there were tensions, as we've seen, autonomistic tensions with this, and there would be a push further to grab certain rights, certain areas, certain fiefs, etc., and to consolidate further some control that naturally the sovereigns had to have. In the Treaty of Corbeil in 1258, which was based ideally on the principle of natural frontiers, the Capetians were also recognized as heirs of the Carolingian dynasty, and as such of rulers over the marches, right, of Spain. And with this, the Capetian king Louis IX renounced formally, in turn, any claim of overlordship over Catalonia. That is to say, they were recognized this authority to properly say, okay, we renounce to it, because just as being recognized as by being recognized as such, they could afford to do it in international law at that point. So this was a general, clear idea. Catalan influence north of the Pyrenees, so beyond Roussillon, Val-Espire, Conflans, Cap Sire, was to cease. And naturally, the area would remain importantly troubled historically. War between France and Spain broke out, multiple times along the frontier that were heavily fortified and castled, as you know. If you visit the area, some of the most beautiful castles in Europe. And James I had realized quite pragmatically that any attempted push in the north against the French would have ended up in disaster, right? And they had to be careful, because the French had instead not quite given up equally their aims on especially the county of Barcelona, because that was the richest one. And in January 1266, however, James I besieged and captured Murcia and settled mostly Catalan colonists there, which tells you how differently also probably these various areas would perceive each other to the need of establishing like another population in it. Also, it ended Murcia over to Castile with the Treaty of Cazorla, as we were saying before. So they had first taken it, but maintained a certain proximity to it, but fundamentally handing it over Castile that could open to the Mediterranean. To no huge advantage for Castile itself, but still for the sake of saying, we are the strongest ones, and if we want, we will have our opening on the Mediterranean. Further south were the Muslims still. So technically here, it was also a way to secure like a bit of a buffer state, because from the Aragonese perspective as well, because this between the crown and the Muslims would be this Castilian strip, right, of land, of coast. The kingdom of Mallorca, including the counties of Sardinia and Roussillon Vespers and the city of Montpellier, was held independently from 1276 to 1279 by James II of Mallorca. So you see also the division within the same crown, that it could be in fact different properly individuals, right? And as a vassal of the crown of Aragon after that date, becoming a full member of crown of Aragon later on, much later on, just in 1344. So these were all perceived technically as different kingdoms on their own, and factually they were, because there was no firm, permanent occupation presence. They would just cooperate in a broader sense. They would obey to, the main directives and, interests and objectives of these commonly recognized leaders that were recognized as such, as long as they wouldn't, annoy such realities more than much. Valencia also was made a new kingdom with its own institutions, and not an extension of Aragon, was not incorporated in the kingdom, as the Aragonese nobility had intended since even before the creation of the crown of Aragon. Right? They didn't want. They probably recognized that it was even there not much headway that they could make. Right? That it was better for them to concentrate maybe on the western border with Castile. So the kingdom of Valencia became the third member of the crown, together with Aragon and Catalonia. And Mallorca legal status, as we've seen, would as a kingdom would become later, and it was not even ranked, I think, at the same level, right? In 1282, very important international event shook the Guelph hegemony that had been established after the Angevin Crusade on Manfred of Sicily, the last of, let's say, the last factual ruler of Swabian Sicily, which is the Sicilian Vespers. You know that the Provence here, the Count of Provence, Charles of Anjou, that was brother of the King of France, Louis IX, had, in fact, led this crusade against the heretic Manfred, the illegitimate son of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor. And they had occupied thus mainland southern Italy plus Sicily. Sicily had been historically the properly with Palermo, the capital of the broader kingdom of Sicily. At this point was considered unitarily and effectively would remain so in spite of the different administrative traditions that would follow from the Sicilian Vespers effect on. However, they also had gradually shifted the capital to Naples, that was rising as the greater power, while the Sicilian economy was being disrupted by these constant civil wars and so on. And in fact, however, properly the grip with, like, the Angevins were more interested in proximity with the papacy, so that they would consider Naples first and Sicily second. And the Sicilian Vespers broke out. The Sicilian Vespers are, if you look at the romantic nationalist Italian tradition, there was, the rebellion, the Sicilian people against the foreign. Well, actually, it was just a very well concerted military, of coordination, political coordination between the various Sicilian barons, but chiefly Aragon and the Byzantine Empire, because Charles of Anjou was about to launch a crusade a military expedition to reconquer Constantinople again, after they had been reconquered by the Paleologoi after the Fourth Crusade, etc. So the risk was there. If the Sicilian Vespers had not happened, the French would have consistently reconquered Constantinople. We would live in a completely different reality under many points of view. Instead, this major mess that is effectively basically half of this kingdom. Now, Charles of Anjou had surely France from his side, but he was, as we've seen, it was a dynastic reality as well. Also, Provence was part of the Holy Roman Empire, technically. It wasn't even French, as we intended, monarchically. But, he was just Count of Provence. And at that point, in fact, he hadn't not such a huge power until he conquered Sicily, right? And therefore, this kingdom was now split in half, as Peter III of Aragon responded. The Sicilian call landed in Trapani in the east, in the west of the island, and would basically take over the same, right? And in the process, and this sees you also, again, as we were saying before with the Albigensian Crusade, how much the Aragonese cared in practice, but this was actually pretty common if you look at the highest, many other rulers, etc., were excommunicated by Pope Martin IV, because the papacy at that point was the Angevin policy maker, and this was definitely a Ghibelline attack. Consider the Aragonese were in this sense allied with the empire, were factually, yes, an anti-papal Angevin power in the international scenario, right? Also, Sicily was placed under interdiction, and the kingdom of Aragon was offered to a son of Philip III of France, right? So hoping to knocking out properly the Iberian power as such. Now, the seizing of Sicily is a major event, because fundamentally it would remain under this as a vice kingdom. And later on, this was technically a kingdom, but eventually things changed administratively. It would remain until the Italian unification, or at least until 1734, when the kingdom of two Sicilies was properly created as a different unitary reality within the continuation, at least, of this Iberian, originally Iberian control, right? And this is important in medieval history also because it engulfed a great part of the Western Mediterranean. As we'll see, the Aragonese eventually expanded also in Sardinia and even partly in Greece. So there were always this thorn in the side for the Neapolitan kingdom, and that would be, in the 15th century, we'll see now, eventually conquered by Alfonso V of Aragon. And this would cause a lot of... naturally, this became a frontier. As we were saying before, Sicily had been essentially by far the most advanced kingdom in Latin Germanic Europe in Norman and Swabian times, right? Its level of centralization had no parallels in the rest. And at this point, everything had crumbled, right? Sicily wasn't much of a great power, and so there is no comparison with Naples, for example. Naples was definitely more, unitary, better structured under the Angevins, right? And Sicily, however, was there, and it was an important naval base. It was, as we've seen, intermittently, properly connected with the Aragonese policy. And it caused, we made videos, for example, about Roger de Flor, its rise, all this piracy that followed at the moment of the break of such big unitary realities that, in a way, it's also how the Catalan company rose. And in a moment of crisis, that is the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, where Europe enters in recession, these major powers gradually shrink, and therefore adventurers and take over, and new borders are defined again. So it's a very interesting reality to study. The Aragonese would launch often raids on, the Sicilians that would mostly, because that was technically the navy of the Kingdom of Sicily, would launch attacks on the Neapolitan coast. They backed the Germanic expeditions of Henry VII, of Louis the Bavarian. There were lots of coordinations, broadly meant. in this space. But always remember this, not as a broader unified Aragonese policy, because this factually never happened as such, right? When eventually Peter III refused to impose the charters of Aragon in Valencia, the nobles and towns united in Zaragoza to demand a confirmation of their own privileges, which the king had to accept in 1283. And thus began the Union of Aragon, which developed the power of the Justicia to mediate between the king and the Aragonese bourgeois, right? Which, as you understand, was also developing for the middle classes, where at this point, especially in Catalonia, were overexpanded. Like the 13th century had seen a massive rise of Barcelona. Also, when James II of Aragon completed the conquest of the Kingdom of Valencia, the Crown of Aragon established itself properly as one of the major powers in Europe, with a broader, more systematic organization of these dominions. In the meanwhile, the dispute between the Adjuvantes and the Aragonese continued, because, by the way, the Neapolitans were launching essentially massive scale invasions of Sicily, basically without ever accomplishing much. An enormous effort that bled on the long run the Angevins white. Like, the Neapolitan kingdom was really rich, but all this time you realize they launched expedition after expedition after expedition, always basically managing maybe to storm a bunch of castles around the coast, but never making a headway in the hinterland. And think about all the logistical complications, even if the distance are short, but we're talking about the 13th century. And to let's say, to accommodate a bit the situation, because here the logic may be not clear, but we should enter much more in depth, because with papal policy and all the various individuals, etc. But in 1297, Pope Boniface VIII created ex novo a kingdom of Sardinia and Corsica. The kingdom of Sardinia had already been created, as we were saying before, by Frederick II for his son Heinz. That was eventually captured by the Bolognese. It was like the curse on that, on the Swabian dynasty. Everybody ended more or less horribly. So Boniface resumed a bit this reality by adding Corsica, that also with Sardinia properly had never much done anything with, and it entrusted it as a fief to the Aragonese king James II by ignoring the already existing indigenous states. So Boniface VIII was actually trying to mediate between the two powers for reasons that in here were benefiting Aragon, but following popes actually were quite angry, in fact, when in 1324 the Catalans properly, invaded Sardinia, right? This was not a Sicilian joint operation. No, this was properly the Crown of Aragon launching from mainland Iberia an expedition to seize actually the Pisan territories in the former states of Cagliari and Gallura, because Sardinia was essentially populated in the hinterland that is pretty rough and inhospitable by these indigenous states that had sort of maintained some kind of an entity under a continuation even of Roman law from Byzantine times, etc. But they were, the richest lands by far were in the south, and especially this trade posts along the coast where there is, in fact, that were seized by the peasants, right? They were struggling with the Genoese in fact, Genoa had, consistently occupied Corsica, even in there on the hinterland, and then the peasants in Sardinia. There's plenty of towers of places built by the Tuscans in Sardinia at that time. So, in order to conquer the area and ensure this further logistical base and important control of cities like Cagliari were important, etc. Sardinian coast, the Aragonese literally invaded it. It was a terrible war, by the way, but the Aragonese managed to defeat the peasants and their German mercenaries at the Battle of Luca Cisterna in the same 1324. The war had begun the year before. And it was a hell of a, Sardinia, as we were saying, it's a terrible territory. It was full of malaria, etc. So even if the peasants were ousted, fundamentally the Sardinian indigenous populations managed, backed by the Genoese, to resume guerrilla, and which went on for an astonishing amount of time. There is also debate on why the Genoese didn't press further, because they had a dramatic interest to oust Aragon, and they had actually the resources to do it, but they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't press too hard, and this, for understanding that, one should look at Genoese internal policy, the various houses. In fact, in 1347, Aragon had properly waged war at sea, mostly with on the Genoese Doria and Malaspina houses, right? Because these inhabit, they had seigneuries on their own in the Lugodoro state in northwestern Sardinia, right? And they mostly occupied them, but Genoese presence remained there for a very long time, intermittently, right? Because you understand what the Italians had done is they had carved some seigneuries in Sardinia. It was a bit like a Wild West, right? They exploited local mineral resources, local labor force. The internal land didn't have the same development of the Italian city-states. There was a saying that, you were citizen in at home in Italy, in Tuscany, in Liguria, whatever, and lord in Sardinia. And so that gives you the picture of how properly devoid of a public order and how deeply privatized that land was, and therefore it was full. Like the war in Sardinia lasted, the guerrilla, but rather lasted for a good century, even more, right? Before being put down more or less effectively. And the only actual independent Sardinian state within this was the Judicato of Arborea, that was even more properly difficult to subdue in itself because of the difficulties of the hinterland and partly the warlike nature. In fact, the Arboreans at some point withstood towards in many occasions the Aragonese presence. It was almost expelled from the island, especially in the wars of 1368-1388 to the one from 1392-1409. So that tells you also how the length of these wars, right? And only in the last year, when the army of Arborea suffered a heavy defeat by the Aragonese army in the Battle of San Luri, their capital, Oristano, was lost the following year, and after some other years, actually, further guerrilla and even successful resurgence, the Arboreans accepted essentially to sell their remaining rights for 100 gold florins. That was enough, but not even, it was, for considering other purchases that were done in around that time, wasn't even that much. The Aragonese kingdom of Sardinia was properly extended all over the island by 1420, right? So in the process, Corsica remained out. So fundamentally, the aforementioned kingdom of Sardinia and Corsica came apart as such, but was never revived, just Sardinia, and remained as a kingdom as such. Eventually, through the marriage of Peter IV to Maria of Sicily in 1381, the Kingdom of Sicily, as well as the duchies of Athens and Neopatria, were tied more firmly to the crown of Aragon. However, as we were saying before, the Greek possessions were lost for good to Nerio I Acciaioli in 1388. Also, Sicily was dissociated in the hands of Martin I from 1395 to 1409. Right. So again, there were different ruling houses properly within the same dominions, right? And you couldn't say, okay, well, depending on their policy, on the international conjunctures and all these things, they could simply act on their own, right? Here, it's important to stress there was no single firm center that could actually extend its control on these other entities. Hence, there was no way to secure them and with a even lack of unity of command of coordination of these broader lands. They otherwise could have done much more. However, in fact, and this was carried out by Alfonso V of Aragon, that was also in Sicily, so had consistently revived also important military capacities, etc., implemented. The Kingdom of Naples was added finally, right, in 1442, and this was by far the strongest, right, of all the dominions, because it was, at that point, it would obviously at that point form again a dyad with Sicily as well, and this was the major chunk, effectively, of Aragonese power, by sheer amount of resources, of population, etc. So this was the other big shot that came at the end of the broader decline of the Angevin dynasty, with their own internal struggles, and it was at this point also fit in a much broader, systematized international situation that looked at various dynastic ties, in which Spain was merging with its monarchies in a much more, defined way internationally. In 50 years, the Moors would have been overthrown completely from Spain, and these lands and this countries, would naturally go to war with France as the major, neighboring power that had in fact ambitions on Naples, because they claimed the Angevin legacy on the same. Also with Milan, in fact, that was at some point, in fact, allied with the Aragonese, in order to check the French movements. So in a much greater context that, again, even today we don't have the time to explain, but has to do with all the balance of power in Europe, the Italian signories, and these things we can't treat now. Still, all these powers were ruled as proxy through local elites, as petty kingdoms, right? In order to secure the Neapolitan conquest, Alfonso V had to negotiate massively with the Neapolitan barons that increased further their control on the hinterland. Actually, now that I remember, I made a video about the administration of Aragonese Sicily that deals exactly with this problem. There are very interesting economical policies that Alfonso V, the Aragonese in general, implemented there. For example, developing the wool production trade, because there were lots of important mountaineer communities in southern Italy, as in Spain, actually, that could be used in this sense as estates to counter baronial power, etc. And the great effect of the political, let's say, proximity of all these dominions was mostly economical, right? The crown of Aragon could now enjoy, especially from its center in Barcelona, this broader Mediterranean connection, right? So with lots of internal markets, such as the Sardinian, the Sicilian, the Neapolitan one, the Aragonese one, etc. In fact, flowing through the mainly held Aragonese trade posts and routes. So, in spite of the intermittent wars with Genoa, all these things, well, there was a general prosperity, and that helped further political institutional consolidation in the various kingdoms. In fact, a way to further centralize was to multiply in these lands some representative assemblies. There was a tension properly with the single rulers as we've seen, of the crown, that may have had something to say, and even if they were closely related, they had factually different interests locally. But the creation, for example, in territories gained from the Moors, like Valencia or Mallorca, were provided with fueros, or furs in Catalan, if you want, that were essentially these parliaments, these assemblies provided with with political participation and legal, properly an institutionalization within the kingdom that could provide representatives to claim their instances, to debate questions, were a way to let's say put at the same level all these dominions, so that none of them would kind of prevail over the others. And paradoxically, in this fashion, it could develop, let's say, a culture that would be more willing to provide at that point more power to the crown as such, right? So that it could not quite extend, because if a single one of these lands had become more powerful over the others, naturally all that previous tradition of let's say of autonomy, etc., would have been used against the crown in a sense. Maybe it would have even produced something more centralized in the longer run, but it would have been from local nobility. It would have at that point contested properly the instances of the crown in an ever more autonomistic way from their own single perspective. So instead, the crown managed to maintain this balance and thus to acquire some greater capacity. As I was saying in that video on the development of the Iberian monarchies, we've seen this happening in the same Castile, right? It was normal in European states at this point in transition towards early modern state. And especially the Reconquista monarchies had this new opportunity in the moment they had properly conquered new lands from scratch, right? That already had, as we've seen, important communities on their own, but in the moment in which they were seized by force, naturally could be molded in a more instrumentally governmental sense, let's say, and a bit more engineered. Also, usually by placing the new territories under the direct rule of nobility, and therefore co-opting them and creating more hierarchical structures that could at that point supersede ours. And in 1410, King Martin I died without leaving descendants or heirs. Thus, by the Pact of Caspe, Ferdinand of Antequera, from the Castilian dynasty of Trastamara, received the crown of Aragon as Ferdinand I. And his grandson, King Ferdinand II of Aragon, recovered also the northern Catalan counties of Roussillon and Cerdagne, which had been lost to France, as well as the Kingdom of Navarre, by the way, which had recently joined the crown of Aragon, but then had been lost again after internal dynastic disputes, therefore consolidating further the power of the Aragonese crown. And in the broader issues that also intervene in Castile, Portugal, the Moors, etc., in 1469, Ferdinand married the Infanta Isabella of Castile, half-sister of the King Henry IV of Castile, who became Queen of Castile and Leon after Henry's death in 1474. And this marriage is indeed one of the single most important events in late medieval or early modern, if you prefer, Europe. A dynastic union that would essentially trigger the rise of what we know as the Kingdom of Spain, unitarily speaking, and explaining before how this was a very gradual process, though, but it definitely started from this. And in fact, Castile and the Crown of Aragon were two distinct territories with their own traditional institutions, parliaments, and laws. I've just seen Castile was much easier to govern, right, than Aragon. It was almost frustrating in this, local, emphasis towards autonomy that wouldn't, that had probably even made losing all these territories loss of opportunities in terms of power building, construction. Such union was eventually further consolidated. You know what happened. Their daughter Joanna eventually married with the Habsburg, Philip the Fair, and but consistent problems followed because Philip died early on, Joanna was essentially emarginated. But their son, Charles the First, actually in this perspective, but Emperor Charles V, right, in 1516, summed all these kingdoms in his persona by dynastic union on the Iberian Peninsula, except the Kingdom of Portugal and the Algarve, albeit he also married famously, the main Portuguese marriage. And thus, while the Spanish state was in the meanwhile had expanded quite fast, right, with the wars in Italy, with the consolidation in Milan, in other minor states, etc., and rising. In fact, it is the great, as a sum of powers, at least the greatest power in Europe, right? While individually it was still France fundamentally, and it would remain. So further consolidation passed through other broader Spanish policy. For example, Aragon participated in this regard to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, the Muslims in 1502, all the so-called the limpieza de sangre, so the limpidity of blood measures that were forced at either forced conversion or expulsion, etc. And the expulsion of the Moriscos, in fact, later, finally in 1609. And eventually, historically how things went. The French consolidated in further after the period of Wars of Confession, so the Roussillon was lost again to them in 1659. Also, Minorca was lost, right, after the War of Spanish Succession. The same with the Italian domains. The pass to the Austrians and or to the Piedmontese, etc. Also, we are later on naturally in a time in which state building was much more, imposing and impacting in the local communities. Roussillon in 1700 was imposed the French language, right, and as well as the Castilian in Spain was essentially expanding as the language of government, also in the old Aragonese crown lands. And this is a broader process that took over, basically in any other country. There is a specific center that eventually incorporates the others, so the Languedoc in France, Castilian in Spain, Bavarian in Germany, Florentine in Italy, and English in the British Isles, and so on. So all this is part of eventually what would go on as the suppression endly of the Crown of Aragon, right? In 1716, as we were saying before, by Philip V with the Bourbon dynasty and the French alliance. There are no Pyrenees anymore. That's Louis XIV commented on. We could make a last consideration about the legacy of the Crown of Aragon from a cultural point of view. As we were hinting at before, as you know, there are many independentist movements, especially in Catalonia, in other lands that, felt historically deeply this sense of difference, of distance from, especially the main powers were always more or less overlapping with the areas of Castile, right? This is the Ebro Valley, the area of Catalonia, etc., was objectively, since a long time, if you study Visigothic history, they were always rebelling. They were more Romanized. They were a bit or something else. They spoke effectively a bit of a different language, especially at that point, for sure. And I tell you this, I'm not a great fan of independentistic movements, because today they are objectively debatable at many levels. It was a time in which I was a staunch federalist, and I still like the idea of federation, but these things can work when there is properly a general commitment that makes a unitary direction obvious in this agreement by maintaining kind of a greater autonomy. Today, I think too many capitals are hampering the process of civilizational development and prosperity, and we're heading towards that path, whether we like it or not, because our communicational capacities, our production are always speedier, are always larger, more effective. These things will blend in. It's a broader process. The process, people call it globalization in a sense. And yeah, the world has always been globalized independently from what naturally this is increasing dramatically, especially in this time. So you may have different ideas about this, but even as such, so as a person that wouldn't be eager to recognize and who is not from Spain, so also may from one side not understanding much about it, but having heard my share of things, having colleagues that have very deep involvement in Spain, etc. And both were biased, and I realized that from a ideological point of view, either from one side or the other, because I'm fair but stern but fair about this. It seems to me, from a historical point of view, that because of these independentistic issues, the historical reality from both sides is usually a bit altered, and it is in the measure in which, from those who oppose this, they want to stress that it was never like a kind of identity of those lands. There were, like in Romanticism, there is a lot of nationalism involved. There's been pseudo history invented, of course, from independence. This all happened all the time. So from their side too, that's just garbage, right? But from a strictly historical point of view, I have no interest in this sense to stress. This is not. I do recognize, as a medievalist, I often came across this realities of this topic, that indeed these northern eastern Iberian lands had a different history. It had a different, by some degree, but not saying that they didn't have anything in common. They had definitely a lot in common, even with Castile, with other, with the broader Iberian Peninsula, that indeed has something on its own. By historically speaking, you understand from many things. Especially I've studied this from a military point of view. It's striking how this was another world by a certain degree, and it's very overlooked at the same time, especially from terms of military development. We find things by the 11th and 12th century in terms of military technology, armor development, etc., that you would say, well, what are the most developed countries at this point? France, Italy, whatever. You find these stuff in Spain, and it's not very much studied. I don't know what's the level of interest in military history in Spain towards these topics. I don't think it's so great like in any other country at this point. As a matter of fact, military history is not studied internationally that much for what it deserves, so I always have a... But I think that there may be much more to be told. The sources, the level of documentation, it varies in degrees, because paradoxically, by the Iberian monarchies had in spite of all, a very important statal development. Like if you search by the 14th century, already you find an enormous amount of archives of sources of documentary production that in other countries you don't quite find by that scale, right? Properly stemming from the crown, right? But for the immediately previous times, also because of the Reconquista, the devastations, and properly the passage from an administration from a government to another, it's more difficult to reconstruct Spanish history than it seems. And this is also the impression I had, that also in the broader books, material I use, that there is always a different cut in the way Iberian history is told, medieval times from a military point of view, whatever, compared to mostly what is essentially the post-Carolingian areas, right? Indeed, the ones we discussed today, as we've seen, were part of the Spanish mark, etc. So they may fit in a regard. In fact, those especially, in the northeast, where there was a great influence from the west, as you've seen, also an important connection with Occitania, etc. That is to be seen easily, right? Even not just if you visit these lands, but probably even if you go in Occitania, you understand it's a different country from France. There is a different air. It reminds you of Spain. So these are just, I don't know, vague considerations, and I don't even know how interested you are in them. But yes, let's be careful. Like being against or pro-independentistic movements in Catalonia, whatever it is, doesn't have to make you... and it has no importance factually, even if these people are going to instrumentalize the thing from one side or the other. What a sane historical judgment has to be about, a bit about this, but about any other thing for that matter, right? So let's say I sympathize for those who say that there are some cultural features here that are worth being noticed as, importantly different from Castile, but it's kind of obvious, right? It's like in other lands here, and which the same Aragon and Spain later on were also part of. Think about, I don't know, southern Italy and how it fell within this reality. It's not much just because it was Spanish dominated. Properly, it was a collapse of a state at some point with the rise of the baronial rule, etc. And this would, on the long run, make the reforms, the subtle reforms, the Enlightenment fail by the 18th century, and that's why by the 19th century the situation was what it was, and the North took over, right? And so these are things that matter because European history is all intertwined, right? And certain lands, think about Sardinia itself, right? How it was even with these other countries, the Kingdom of Mallorca, etc. They were created from scratch, in a sense, to fit certain political purposes, certain swings, oscillations, and so on. And this is, at least with the Crown of Aragon, this kind of mindset comes easy because it's kind of one of the most representative realities in Europe of this kind, right? And it's quite fascinating because I can't think of another European power at this point that emerged with the same degree of autonomistic, let's say, of institutionalized autonomistic tradition like the lands of the Aragonese crown, right? So it's truly unique in its own regard. And there are you see it when you study military history, or when you study in its sources about the Catalans. I had the possibility recently of studying, reconstructing even some battles that I quoted about, not on Schwerpunkt, from a serious thing. You realize that there are some extremes, right? For example, the Catalan nobility was, as I was saying before, imbued with a dramatically intense chivalric, knightly, almost Frankish culture, right? And next to that, so the top of the heroic, also frankly gross exaggerations, probably from a literary style point of view, right? You check other historians at this time. They had there was a very heavy ideologism. I didn't know whether it was exactly because of this attempt to maybe confer a ruler of some greater power from an ideological point of view, because factually they were so limited from an administrative point of view. But I don't know if that might have been part of a cruder, like the Reconquista was a brutal molder of culture, right? It emerged, this idea of chivalry, of this honor. This is something that the Spanish maintained strongly, like in their hidalgos, and they lived on even in much of early modern warfare. Think about the Territorial and its own, the idea that nobody was punished to be deserted because it was just a honor to be there, and there were lots of nobility on foot. Nobility spread properly among the people. Like at the end of the Reconquista, 1/3 of the Spanish adult males fit in the hidalgos. That was, as you understand, not quite a nobility, mostly as a gentry, if you had to make parallelisms with other countries. But they were imbued with this military, almost obsession, right? That had, literally, these countries had emerged as such from the Reconquista, right? This is the point, right? This is not a country that was more or less always there and coalesced and conglomerated, whatever. No, these guys had to literally carve their own kingdom out of a military conquest. So you think how deeply connected. We see it in the videos, the other videos about the Reconquista, of how strong, intense that this military bias was. From the other side, and okay, this was a digression, but speaking of, you see next to these highly, chivalric, etc., you find troops like the Almogavars, right, that are literally the worst scum on earth by any standard, right, in that, however, you find them cited as light infantry next to heavy cavalry in a combination that, if you want, is quite unique, especially considering these are not, well, okay, yes, in other countries maybe, but you see, these were mountaineers, they were pirates, they were not like an orderly militia ordained and controlled. They would side next to it. There are interesting, even military developments in this sense. In fact, I'm looking forward to make some videos about the military organization of such countries, because still we have to do at some point. But anyhow, I just so again, we will keep talking about all the individual powers because they deserve. Today's video was just like as a chat about this broader picture. But for now, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.